Mass shootings inevitably leave us with questions. What led this particular individual to act out in such a hateful way? Were they mentally ill? And why didn't anybody see this violence coming in time to do something to prevent it? As it turns out, there is a warning sign that somehow remains hidden in plain sight. Before they wreak havoc with their guns, some 60% of mass shooters have committed domestic and intimate partner abuse. From KERA in Dallas, this is Think. I'm Krys Boyd. My guest, Cynthia Miller-Idriss, is a sociologist and professor in the School of Public Affairs and the School of Education at American University, where she is founding director of the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab. And she argues that if we want a safer society, we have to recognize and address the strong links between patriarchy, white supremacy, homophobia, xenophobia, and mass violence. Her book is called Man Up: The New Misogyny and the Rise of Violent Extremism. Cynthia, welcome to Think.
Thanks so much for having me.
First things first, what counts as a documented history of intimate partner or domestic violence among mass shooters? Does this include like threats and stalking and online harassment, that kind of thing?
It doesn't. I mean, that's one of the things that was so stunning to me. And I should say, I open the book with an apology to the field, basically, for not paying attention to this myself earlier. This is my fourth book on the subject of violent extremism, prevention of mass violence and radicalization. And I didn't look at it either. And I was shocked by that statistic when I ran across it. So that 60%, it's in the US since 1949, of violent mass shooters or mass attackers have a documented history of domestic and intimate partner violence. That just means the criminal records include that. And so that's in a situation where over half of domestic and intimate partner violence goes unreported to begin with. And it also doesn't include things like stalking or harassment or sexual assault or rape threats or online forms of harassment, cyber porn, those types of things that are also widely problematic and growing in the online universe.
So it sounds like a history of domestic violence should be seen as an enormous red flag for future acts of violence. Are these convictions treated that way? Like, is somebody keeping watch on abusive, and it is mostly men after they're caught?
No one connects we know that it's a history. Every so often you will hear someone on sort of what I call my side of the field, the national security side, say, well, we know that most of these attackers have a history of domestic and intimate partner violence, but that's seen as a local issue, a private issue often in the home. And you'll see that as when people are convicted of it who are public figures, they'll say, please give us our privacy, right? Like, this is a private issue, a private matter, a family matter. We're dealing with it. And it's dealt with privately on the local level by local law enforcement. And so it's literally different agencies that address it: Department of Justice, Department of Homeland Security. So we don't really have those. I mean, the FBI has a list of 22 or 23 warning signs before a mass shooting. And there's nothing about gender. It might say interpersonal problems, right? Or that kind of thing. But it doesn't indicate specifically a history of violence against an intimate partner. And it certainly doesn't say anything about gender, which is almost always there.
Please understand that I am not looking to provide cover for anyone who commits domestic or intimate partner violence, but the number of people who do those crimes vastly outnumbers the number of people who commit mass crimes.
Absolutely, right. And this is where it's really important to note what I'm talking about here is correlation, not causation. And also, I wouldn't want there to be a situation where people did not report because they were afraid their partner was going to end up on a watch list or with some kind of FBI investigation, right? So we don't want to do anything to lessen the chance that victims or survivors report this. So it's not like you can say, oh, if you're convicted of that, that means, it's some kind of provable connection, some causal connection. But it means, what it is in the data, what I looked at is that between that statistic and the fact that almost every other case I found, I had a very hard time finding any cases where you didn't have some other history, meaning, the Charleston shooter who, and I don't even want to repeat what he said, but he said while he was attacking peaceful African-American worshipers, said something about, I'm doing this because y'all are sexually assaulting our women, right? So this, false crime statistics and a gendered motivation. So it's not always just violence against women. Sometimes it's some other type of gendered, misogynistic, or sexist idea that is at root, or some other history in their own personal behaviors in how they're behaving online, even though the targets of those violent acts are often other people.
We're all aware that the headlines are full of disturbing stories about men and boys who react violently when they're rejected by women and girls. You remind us here, though, that there are countless more like banal stories of bad male behavior in response to being told no by a female. And the scary part about these is that we barely notice them.
Yeah, the everyday, I mean, the question of rejection itself and of teaching boys and young men how to handle rejection is one of the most important things that's happening right now in the burgeoning men's wellness space, which is a space led by men, spaces of groups of men who are trying to work with boys and young men to kind of develop healthier, more expansive ideas of masculinity. And I talk a lot about them in the book, and I'm often in conversation with men who lead those groups when I talk about the book in public, because I think it's so important to call men into this conversation and because they have such good ideas about how to do it. And one of those things is dealing with this question of rejection, because rejection can lead so quickly to mobilization to violence against women, both in an immediate way, right? These banal everyday ways of men, I mean, awful examples of girls getting shot or hurt, because they turned down a prom date, or a man hitting a girl with a car because she said no, she wouldn't get in his car, right? Just these immediate acts of almost like road rage, anger that come when someone is rejected, but also rejection in the form of breakup and heartbreak, and then how that leads often to some kind of scapegoating of women overall as manipulative or devious or transactional. And that can lead into bad pathways online, with influencers sort of selling a package of anti-women, anti-feminist ideas.
I want to talk for a minute about those influencers because you mentioned there are men's wellness spaces. Then there's the thing we call the manosphere. Are these men's wellness spaces full of like decent guys trying to do the right thing? Are they technically part of the manosphere?
They're outside the manosphere. I would say they're the alternative to it, right? So the manosphere is a term that refers to a kind of collection of blogs, forums, influencers, websites that promote really harmful and hateful and violent ideas about women, ranging from campaigns to promote the idea that rape claims are false, to calls to really hurt women the way that women have been hurt at like a yoga studio shooting or the Santa Barbara sorority shooting, right? So those are called violent incels, those groups, really promoting an exploitative and objectifying view of women, that they have a sexual market value that expires, right? That they're only there for breeding purposes. That's language that they use. Really, really awful. I mean, I just had someone in a talk, a practitioner in the field, say that her daughter, her 12-year-old daughter, had just asked her what the phrase submissive and breedable means, right? So she encountered that from other kids, right? Like that this kind of language comes out of the manosphere and then circulates in memes and makes its way into the mainstream as something sort of amusing and ironic. And the men's wellness groups are trying to counter that, with healthier ideas about relationships, healthier understandings of what it is to become a man, and better ways of connecting so that boys and men are less isolated, less detached from society, less likely to spend time on their own fomenting in rejection.
One of the things you raise here, you talked about apologizing for not having gone down this road with your own research. It shocked me that it had never occurred to me before, which is that certain kinds of misogynist statements, memes, jokes, um, they're a form of hate speech. I
Yeah.
mean, I think I recognize sexist speech when I see it. It had never occurred to me to like ask a social media company to get rid of it because sexist speech is hate speech.
Yeah, it is a form of hate speech. We should be thinking about it as a form of hate speech. And there are places in the UK, for example, where they do regard misogyny as a form of hate speech. And there, in Canada and Australia, there are other countries that take these issues more seriously, particularly as they relate to political violence, in part because we know that in the data now, either the very top predictor or among the top three predictors across multiple countries' surveys show that the connection between, for political violence, the biggest predictor is misogyny or hostile sexism. So along with things like racism and xenophobia, it's in the mix of the top three. And sometimes in some cases, in two recent studies I've seen, is the top predictor. So everyone in this country right now is understandably worried about political violence. For the first time in my life, I saw a recent New York Times poll say that Americans are more worried about political division and political violence even than the economy. I've never seen that. And so it's really at the top of our minds. And we actually know what predicts it, and yet we don't really address it, certainly not with tech companies' moderation policies, nor with our hate speech policies. And even sometimes in cultural ways, we don't really address it, in part because we don't always see it.
You do not strike me as alarmist or humorless. You live in the real world. Sometimes among groups of women, we make jokes that, in particular contexts could come across as sexist against ourselves. I think men do the same thing. Is there an easy way to draw that dividing line between what is really dangerous and what is legitimately blowing off steam?
Yeah, it's hard because this is culture, right? And it's one of the things I say about the definition of misogyny that I use is one that comes from the philosopher Kate Manne, which says, misogyny is not just hate against women or hatred of women, because that's a kind of simple colloquial understanding of it that we use. It's really more about gender policing. It's about a kind of law enforcement arm of the patriarchy that tells boys and girls and men and women how to live up to the expected norms or behaviors, and then polices them for it. So boys are subject to it too. They get bullied to that kind of gender policing with a lot of homophobic bullying that, men will tell me, and I've done interviews with men my whole life, that they've like sort of survived the gauntlet of adolescence by slicing off little parts of themselves to fit into a box that now is sort of been called upon to change, right? And so it's they are constantly policed by other boys for fear of being called gay, that they should behave a certain way, right? And so misogyny does affect girls and women more, and there's more violence, of course, directed at girls and women, but it affects all of us. And so, yes, there are jokes, and jokes are one thing, and there's certainly like you can't just live in a super serious, straight-laced, world. And I think it's important to recognize what some of those jokes can do. Let's say a homophobic joke that kids might think is just funny, but there might be a kid in that group who suddenly feels like, oh, I better not, it's a form of gender policing that can also shape how kids feel about themselves. And so thinking carefully about when is something funny and when is it actually policing the behavior of someone else, I think is where I would draw the line.
So, is early gender bias a predictor of how people will feel about and treat the queer folks that they encounter?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think the research on how people feel about queer people they encounter, or how they feel about um, uh, same-sex relationships even, is really changing. So one of the studies I cite in the book, that is probably my favorite study I've read by Joel Middleman for the book, was showed that high school kids now, high school boys, are much more likely to accept same-sex relationships among their peers as long as you're sort of bro about it, right? Like, in other words, they have to be really, like, it doesn't matter to them who they have sex with, but you can't be too effeminate about it. You can't be flamboyant about it, right? And so it's like okay to be gay, but it's not okay to act like, and they use an F word slur to explain that, right? Like, that's what the boys say. And so to me, that says like sexuality itself has become more fluid, especially for a younger generation. And we see that in the data. But masculinity is rigid, is really, really rigid. And so I think one of the things we are seeing in the data about gender bias and about the treatment of queer folks who you meet is it actually is about not as much now about sex as it is about femininity and masculinity and what norms are you violating. So being too effeminate is the bigger affront in the data right now.
Cynthia, you say patriarchy is one of the simplest and also the most complicated terms you are called on to define. Why is that?
Well, if you say patriarchy, everybody knows what patriarchy is, right? More or less. We understand it the way that we understand capitalism. Like, it exists and it's just part of the air that we breathe. And until I actually started looking into it, I don't think I ever really thought about what it's based on. What is patriarchy based on? All it is really is a system of power distribution that unequally distributes power to some men, to men, and who can hold that power over some women and some other men, basically. And so I don't think I really understood it in those terms. And in the end, it's pretty simple, but it rests on a lot of other things. Like the gender binary is really important then. If you start to see a breakdown in the gender binary, or in trans folks, which is one of the reasons why transness is such a perceived threat to patriarchy itself, it confuses the whole power distribution system, right? This is the way that it works. And so you start to see a lot of attacks on transness, in part because that gender binary is so important to defending the nature of the patriarchy and who should have more power.
Is there some reason that trans women seem to be at greater risk than trans men from men who are really invested in the gender binary?
Yeah, there is, and that is essentially in modern patriarchies, masculinity is more valued than femininity, and so, but also more policed. And so it's really interesting. One of the things I argue is that girls and women have more freedom to express a broader range of femininity. Right? You can be, what used to be called a tomboy. Like there's just even what used to be policed. You couldn't wear pants. Women couldn't wear pants at work even 30, 40, 50 years ago. That was, a much more shocking thing to see, right? This gender bending, right? The introduction I just read recently of having a sex identification on a passport was because women were wearing pants and starting to wear jeans, and that was like disrupting signals about men and women. And so they thought we need to have an actual identification on our passport. So that wasn't there from the beginnings, right? And so femininity is more, there's more freedom, but less power. Masculinity is more, has more restrictions. It's more policed, but you have more power, more automatic power and status as men. And so when people transition, there's more perceived affront. This is the theory anyway, right? More perceived affront to transitioning to a woman because you're giving up status and you're choosing something that is less valued in society. And so that feels more offensive to people who would be angry about that, right? Not everyone, not all men, of course, but particularly men who would attack someone for being trans are more likely to attack trans women.
I've heard people describe the United States and, the West more generally as kind of post-patriarchal in that there are no longer laws on the books, with a few rare exceptions, that grant more power or different power to men versus women. You're not convinced that we are past the patriarchy?
Yeah, I mean, this is why I think it took me so long to see it myself because, I talk a lot of examples in the book about my mom who, uh, went to the same college that I went to, but was told by her father that he wouldn't pay for college for a girl, even though she was the class valedictorian, right? So she went and waitressed to pay for it herself and then got married and was pregnant with her third child before she could open up her own bank account or get a credit card without my father's name. I mean, that's the mid 70s, right? That marital rape wasn't outlawed until 1993. So we had this moment kind of after those things happened when I think we felt this is post patriarchal, right? And I certainly felt like I grew up in a time where there weren't any barriers, and I don't think I felt those barriers very much in my own career. So it was very hard for me to see that these norms, the social and cultural norms, still exist until we started seeing this resurgence online. And in the research lab I run, we started seeing it 4 or 5 years ago. The sort of misogynistic comments sneaking in, the kind of women's rights have gone too far, or women should get back in the kitchen. And then that evolved into this manosphere and into influencers who have so much popularity among teenage boys. And so that I think is what I started to see. And once I started looking into it, I was like, okay, these norms are still there. They're just kind of we're having a surge of them at the moment.
I'd be curious about your perspective on this. It seems to me that the trad wife movement gets more attention that is larger maybe than how big it actually is within our society, but it does get a lot of attention.
For
And
sure.
now you have young women in the generations coming up after our generation who go online and openly say the life I want is to submit to a male partner and to do traditionally feminine things.
Yeah.
Where does the trad wife movement fit into all
Yeah,
this?
absolutely. I mean, there was this trend this summer of women calling for also like a soft life and wanting to be a kept wife, right? This kind of some of that language around, which has some of its origins actually in people of color, women of color, and queer women who said like, I'm not going to join this hustle, this capitalist hustle, and so there's some of those origins came from an original social media post that sort of said, I'm going to step away from this hustle and do something different. I don't have to have so much ambition or chase this life, this hard working life that American capitalism promotes. So there were some origins like that, but it got taken over by others who say like, well, the way to do that is to become a kept wife, right? And so then you get to this submissiveness, and also like videos that actually will then purport to teach women how to convince a man to make you a kept wife, right? So that's adjacent to the trad wife movement, which is itself kind of social media content that promotes stepping back from ambitious careers, paid careers, and raising as many babies as you can and cooking like organic stuff. And it's content that's sold, right? I mean, there's beautifully made up women, well dressed, making like gumballs from scratch, and whilst who's taking care of all their babies? Like it's not clear. There must be paid help somewhere. So it's not realistic content, but it promotes a certain kind of lifestyle that's often very appealing, especially in a context where it's very hard to make ends meet, as a young woman or a young man. I mean, the affordability crisis is very real. And so it can feel appealing to just be like, why should I keep spinning my wheels if I'm not going to be able to buy a house anyway or make it? I will say that there's good research coming out of a colleague, Evian Leidig's work in the Netherlands that shows that some of the biggest accounts of the trad wives, the vast majority of subscribers are men, not women. And so it's really interesting to see that it may actually just fuel a fantasy that some men have about being the provider, taking care of this beautiful wife and family who are there to support your needs and meet you with a drink at the end of the day, and not so much what young women themselves want.
I don't spend a lot of time looking for that content online. It's not really my thing,
Yeah.
but what comes across my feed, I will say this, it seems like the people who are getting all this attention and all these sponsorships for being trad wives and having as many babies as possible, they're conspicuously white. Like you don't
Yes.
see a lot of Black women being praised for having 9 kids.
Right. Yeah, and that's partly why it's seen as sort of adjacent to the white supremacist movement, because there has been some bleed over, some transitioning or some recruiting from white supremacist movements. So there's a woman online who explicitly called in those same kinds of spaces for white women to have as many white babies as she had done. She called it the White Baby Challenge, and have 6 white babies to counter demographic change. Right. So there are some influencers who are really promoting, through kind of relatable content in their kitchens, homeschooling and organic cooking and homesteading, not just because that's what they are promoting that they want to do, but because they think that that's the way to restore a kind of white ethno state. And so you see some of that too. And I also think you see women of color who have historically been doing those domestic jobs for white women in this country and others, sort of saying this isn't as much of a fantasy as you think it is, right? That getting away from that role into paid careers was also a liberation.
How important is the distinction between sexism and misogyny? Are these interchangeable terms? Is one just worse than the other?
Yeah, great question. So I use those two terms, as also the way Kate Mann does, which is that the patriarchy itself is upheld by 2 pillars, one of which is sexism, which is a set of attitudes about unequal abilities, basically, between men and women. So whether that's intelligence or capabilities, or sometimes it's benevolent, like women should be protected because they're not safe or capable enough for jobs like mining. They need to be protected. Their bodies need to be protected for child rearing or something. But it's also kind of hostile sometimes, where it's like women are inherently manipulative or devious. So those are attitudes. And then misogyny is the law enforcement part of it, where it's policing the norms and expectations of how people behave. So you're not slender enough, or you're not demure enough, or well behaved enough, or you're not manly enough, you're not protecting your tribe, your family, whatever those expectations are, you're not stoic enough. So when even the title of the book, Man Up, right, this kind of language that boys get, which is to not ask for help, to be dominant and aggressive and always ready to be violent and fight if you have to, as a hallmark of your own manhood, right? And then women get and girls get this other set of messages about being gentle and submissive and pleasant, not difficult, right? And so those are kind of expectations that get policed through misogyny.
You write about the two choices. I mean, there are maybe more than two, but there's the choice to be sort of nice as a woman and not stir up trouble so that you won't be treated badly. The other choice is to use a word that we won't use on the show, but to be a little more strident in
Right.
pushing
Rhymes
back.
with rich, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So, but neither one is a guarantee of safety.
Right, exactly. I mean, that's the rub, is that, as I say right in the opening, like, it's not that being a nice girl is a guarantee, or is not that a nice girl means you'll be safe, because, really nice girls also, just standing there on the side of the street. And one of the examples I use, a girl had her hair pulled and then run over by a man just because she said she wouldn't get into his car. So, there's example after example after example that it's not enough to keep you safe. And there is no, it's a double bind, right? So you're either, and that's true in the workplace too. And we've heard that for a long time, that it's very hard to walk this thin line, and even harder for women of color, of, being considered too difficult versus being assertive, and speaking up for yourself, or being a leader that is not emotional, but emotional enough, right? So you're expected to be caretaker of teams, but also not too emotional yourself. And so it's a very hard line to walk.
Cynthia, I imagine people listening who have kids at home are perhaps saying to themselves, I am not raising my sons to, engage in gender-based violence, and they haven't seen that happen in this house. And then I think about watching, and I recognize that this was, a TV show, but watching Adolescence, where you have this young boy who comes from pretty decent parents. I mean, I'm curious about how much of this can be written off as like kids come from a family that is completely toxic, as opposed to kids who are just looking for guidance and find their way to the wrong website, the wrong platform.
Yeah, I mean, the most common entry point that we see is a self-help search. And what we find is that kids are using online spaces, including AI, to ask for help. And so they will ask, boys in particular, young boys, 13, 12, 11-year-old boys will often ask for, how do I get rich? How do I get fit or stronger or muscular, or dating advice, right? So those are the three kinds of things that can land them on pretty toxic influencers pretty quickly. And even if they don't search, right, for those toxic influencers, they're not searching for any manosphere content. What researchers have found is that within 4 minutes of just like sock puppet accounts being set up and searching for that kind of what gets coded as gendered fitness advice, or things about sports, or dating advice about how do I get a girlfriend, let's say, or how do I, what happens if this girl says no? How can I get her to say yes? That within 4 minutes, you get really toxic manosphere content. And if you even hover over the videos, much less if you watch one of them all the way through, pretty quickly, the majority of your feed is full of that. And I will say that's what the research showed about a year ago. Yesterday, I just heard a report that said a new sock puppet account, they said they set up on TikTok, and within 30 seconds, they got, harmful neo-Nazi content after they had gotten the manosphere content. So these intersections are also becoming pretty bad. And so what I tell parents is, look, this is not about your values. Your values might help a kid reject some of that stuff, but it's very subtle. It's very kind of parasocial. It doesn't start with the toxic stuff right away. It starts with someone saying, hey, men and boys are suffering, and I'm the only one who will talk about it, and then telling you why you're suffering. And so what we find is that boys often know somebody like Andrew Tate is bad, like has bad ideas, they'll say, or is toxic, but they say also he has a point, right? And so they're like absorbing some of the message, even though they understand it's not okay to say that you should hit women, or it's not okay to say that, you know, that women shouldn't vote, or like he does, or to say that, you know, people can be stoned if they cheat on you, right? Like those are kind of some of the ideas of real violent and rights removal kinds of content that come easily. But they'll say, even though they see that stuff as wrong, they see he has a point. So they're absorbing some of those messages. And what you want is them to recognize and reject as much of it as possible.
How do we get them better role models?
Yeah, well, that's one of the most important things. One is like talk to kids as much as you can about what they're seeing online. And this is something that parents, I think, don't realize how badly kids want to do. So I talk to a lot of kids in high schools, and you know, the second you start talking to them about algorithms, they are so ready to talk to you about the content that they receive, and they tell such horrible stories about things they've seen accidentally, like violence, really violent child abuse, animal abuse, regularly, like every day across their feeds. And they don't know what to do with that content. And they're afraid that if they tell a parent, they'll lose their phones. So, one of the things I really, which I laugh because I have also, in all the high schools I've been in over the last couple of years talking about this, only 2 kids said they ever told an adult about the awful content that they'd seen. And in both cases, they did lose their phones. So like that is a common strategy that happens if they tell someone, oh, I saw this awful thing, a murder, a live murder, or a live suicide. I mean, they see all kinds of awful stuff. And so I think one, parents should talk about it, but also in a way that is not judgmental, is curious, and doesn't take their phones as a solution, but asks the kids to start to come up with solutions together. And it's also something that schools can do as part of digital literacy, but also health classes, to have more open conversations about the gendered content that comes across their feeds and also the violent content that comes across their feeds, so that they have a place to talk about it. So having better role models is part of it, but also having spaces, I think, to just discuss it and reflect on it and start to understand, what do I do with this? Because they describe to me that they're just feeling very numb and apathetic about what they see.
Cynthia, I want to talk about entitlement, because it does seem to me that we've done a pretty good job of teaching women and girls that we have every right to say no to what we don't want from men and boys. We have done less of a good job of helping men and boys cope with being told no.
Absolutely. It's one of the things we see right now is that we have done a lot about consent, for example, and helping girls understand and boys understand no means no. But somehow there's not been a parallel effort to teach boys that they're not entitled to the domestic labor of women, or the attention of women, and that a rejection doesn't have to mean anything other than a rejection. Like if women are going to say no to them, they also have to accept that no, not with anger, but with a kind of acceptance of that that's just part of the way things go. And getting a no, getting a rejection doesn't mean you're, you know, an inferior person. I mean, one of the things that boys and men will often say is that they feel, and I have a lot of empathy for this, that they feel that they're being depicted as inherently bad or dangerous. And so we don't want them to get that message either, right? But at the same time, they're not, that doesn't mean they're entitled to react with anger or scapegoating, or a rejection of women, or a solution that says that women's rights have gone too far, that feminism has gone too far, right? The sort of grievance narratives that circulate online that offer boys an answer, an easy answer to very real problems that they have, I think can be very damaging. And so having role models that can work through and explain and talk about some of that content and how it might be subtly shaping their views is really important.
You mentioned grievance narratives, and I'd like to circle back to the thing we were talking about at the top of this conversation, which is the correlation, not necessarily causation, between documented incidents of domestic abuse and intimate partner violence and later commissions of mass violence of the kind that we are all terrified of. You stress that this is correlation and not causation, but there is a pattern here. If you had to hazard a guess, As, social scientists like yourself continue to do more research, why would you think there's this pattern of people who have engaged in misogynist thinking and grievances online are maybe more likely than other people to engage in mass violence?
Yeah. Well, violent misogyny, which is the violent policing of norms and expectations of behavior, is really a way of it, when it's directed at women in an intimate partner situation, of saying you're not adhering to the rules that I expect of you. You're not sufficiently submissive or supportive or have done the things I need. And so there is this expression of entitlement, but also an exertion of power. And that kind of expression of power and control and a demand for status and a demand for others to be submissive comes out in a lot of different ways that are warning signs. I mean, I have a whole chapter in the book that talks also about sex trafficking and child exploitation. There was a Vice News story a few years ago that said simply in its title, "Why are all the neo-Nazis getting arrested for child sexual abuse material?" And that is a constant kind of thread that you see an investigation start because of a plot, but then the arrests are actually made because as soon as the computer is opened up or the devices, you find this material. And I argue that's part of the same pattern of power, of exploitation, of submissiveness, of a demand for kind of total acquiescence to power. And when that isn't satisfying in some way for some men, that anger and rage can spill over. And so we also see in over half of mass shootings in the US, a domestic or intimate partner was part of the target, right? And everyone else is kind of collateral damage. So sometimes it's that there's this history and then they're still targeting that person and it becomes a mass shooting. Sometimes it's that the target, whether it's an elementary school or a newsroom in Maryland or a parade in or a church or a grocery store, that there's still these gendered dimensions that are underpinning it, that are misogynist or sexist or gendered in nature, that we kind of overlook. And so the argument of the book is that if we started to see some of these things as foundational, we might be able to off ramp people earlier into the right kind of therapeutic interventions that would prevent escalations to worse harm.
I want to talk about those interventions because no matter how much you're able to change the world in a positive way, there will always be people who find it easier to attract dating partners, to sort of move with social ease through whatever space they want to be in. There will be people who struggle more. It's just the reality of human nature. What do we do for the people who are struggling so that they're not left kind of spinning up their grievances with other people who are struggling in similar ways? How do we help them?
Yeah, well, one of the most important things that the men's wellness worlds are doing. I mean, there's a great program that's getting a lot of attention right now, that brings men out fly fishing, right? Like we call those shoulder to shoulder interventions. There's a group of men in New York and also in the UK that are doing what are called walking talking programming, where they just invite men to go for walks together. When I first heard about this, I thought, this is actually really funny because in my neighborhood, you do see clusters of people walking together all the time, and they are always women in pairs. And I do it too with neighbors, like, let's go for a walk. You almost never see unrelated men walking together. And if men are walking at all, it's with their partners often or alone, or walking dogs. But you see that all the time with women connecting socially, catching up, forming, kind of more intimate bonds and solidarity by walking with each other, either for exercise or just around the neighborhood. A lot of that started also in the pandemic and has carried forward. And I think, we don't have that. And so finding ways for men to be less isolated, to be connected to each other and form those friendships is essential.
Would it be helpful to look at what our gendered expectations are, all of us, for one another? I mean, I think sometimes, you mentioned earlier that females have more freedom to explore what we might consider masculine looks, masculine activities than men and boys have to explore feminine ones. I mean, how can we start to interrogate what we put in the boy category and what we put in the girl category?
Totally. This is a great question because ultimately, what Niobe Way, for example, who does a lot of work with boys and teenagers, young adults, around the loss of their intimate friendships as they become teenagers and what happens and how they can forge better senses of connection with each other, has really made this point that we should stop referring to kind of masculine and feminine sides, but think about, yes, there are softer capacities and skills and harder ones, right? But empathy and caregiving and asking for help should not be considered feminine traits, right? They should be basic humanity, humanities traits. And what we should be encouraging people is to, have this expansive idea of what it is to be a human being. I think, where it gets hard is, some people have criticized the approach that I recommend as having too much empathy, right, is the word, right? So too much empathy for men, and arguing that really we should be dismantling all of these ideas of rigid masculinity itself. And I think, one of the things I've learned is that you have to meet people where they are. And so it doesn't help to necessarily go at someone who's already consuming some of this content with just well, that's ridiculous kind of argument. And you should just be accepting this broader range of things when what they're doing is, clinging on to some sort of narrative that gives them a sense of meaning or purpose or belonging. They need to find that somewhere. And so it's up to us to find ways to maybe offer alternatives to that might be one step away, might still forge masculine camaraderie or friendship, but ultimately, hopefully, we reach a place where we are all recognizing the full spectrum of human capacities and traits and not having labels on them that say one has to be more feminine and one has to be more masculine.
Do you have a lot of male colleagues doing research in the space that you have focused your career on?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because I talk about this a lot in recent interviews. I have a whole series of interviews with Jackson Katz, who is an expert on domestic and intimate partner violence that just came out in Ms. Magazine, where he asks a lot of questions about what it is to be a woman in this space. I think, I came up as a comparative education professor and a sociologist, which are very heavily woman-dominated spaces, and became a full professor before I ever moved into the kind of national security space, which is very male-dominated, and not just male-dominated, but very dominated by former law enforcement and veterans, sort of military. So it has a very strong securitized approach and not a very strong educational prevention intervention approach in the US. And so I never felt unwelcome in those spaces. I felt unusual in those spaces, but not unwelcome. But I think it's because I had already had status and leadership qualities before I moved over into the space. I think it can be much harder for a lot of other younger women to be taken seriously in those spaces. And also I'm promoting, and traditionally, educational kinds of things that weren't so threatening maybe and in certain ways, right? And so I'm not treading on other territory. I'm introducing new ideas to the field in the US. That's the more cynical take on it, I guess. But I would say, in my field, there are a lot of men who are working on the men's wellness space as in the psychotherapy space, the psychologists, the social workers. It's less so in the national security space that you see those two approaches come together, even though there's also a lot of men in those spaces.
You write about moving into the invisibility stage of women who reach midlife, which is something that I can relate to. I mean, we are trained to kind of rage against that and to continue trying to look younger, act younger, to bring that sort of attention that can be pleasurable. But you consider the invisibility phase a kind of superpower. So I wonder if you would talk about that and what it took you to get there.
Yeah, I included this anecdote in the epilogue because I was talking to my editor about it and we were laughing at it so hard that she said, you just have to include this anecdote. And it is the anecdote that among my women friends produces the most laughter. But when I tell it in public settings, people are always uncertain if they're supposed to laugh. And so it's this story about, a few years ago running in my neighborhood and I got catcalled from behind. And when I turned around over my shoulder to look at the guy, he sort of took a step backward, put his two hands up and said, "Oh, sorry, ma'am." Right? Like he was apologizing, though, as I point out, not for catcalling, but because once he saw my face, he realized he was presumably catcalling someone who might have been old enough to be his mom, right? And so it was like, all at once I realized, like, oh my gosh, I'm crossing out of this era of objectification, which was so normalized, I had sort of forgotten that it ever wasn't and that it might not be again. And so now and I call it this age of invisibility, but it made me feel like I do have a particular obligation to now maybe I can look at these things with a little more cognitive dissonance. Maybe that's why I could write a book like this now, as hard as it was to kind of look deeply at it. And maybe this is, a call to continue to keep the light shined on it, because he wasn't apologizing for catcalling. He would have just been happy to catcall someone younger than me. He was apologizing for catcalling a woman who was too old to catcall.
Cynthia, this has all been really interesting. Thank you for making time to talk.
Thank you for having me.
Think is distributed by PRX, the Public Radio Exchange. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, anywhere you get podcasts, and at our website, think.kera.org. Again, I'm Krys Boyd. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.